Morning all. Let's look at the amazing game in round 9 between Viswanathan Anand and Veselin Topalov. So Vishy, playing white, played e4, and Veselin played the Sicilian defence. After knight f3, d6, we have a Najdorf, and in fact Vishy at this moment plays what Veselin played the round before against Momodorov as white. This quite unusual h3 move. In live book, for those interested, h3 is fairly well down the list. Bishop e3 is quite popular, bishop g5, bishop e2, bishop c4, f4, f3, g3, and it's quite way down the list, but it's an interesting move, and I actually had to play against it with black recently in the club game. Very exciting club game recently. So it's a very interesting move because white is going to fianchetto the bishop and gain space, and g5 looks to be quite useful as a move to try and increase pressure on d5 at the right moment. Black plays e6 here, which is actually the top move. I think e5 kind of goes into white's hands a bit, weakening d5, making g4, g5 a bit more effective. So this is the move I preferred as well in my club game as black, just e6. So white now plays g4, and now actually quite popular here is the immediate break with d5 in the centre for black. So that's the most popular, it seems. So again could continue like taking and like this, where black seems to have quite a free game, but white's got a nagging edge. But okay, another move is just bishop e7 or b5 even. These have all been played before, but we see knight fd7, which has been played before in advance of g5. And now white plays bishop g2. No, it's left the c4 square in this line, so it's kind of, it looks as though c4 is a bit more neglected than usual. Bishop e7, bishop e3. Now knight c6. And here, a very interesting move. Usually players with white have been playing queen e2 in this position. There's 53 games in my line book, or castling, simply castling, or queen d2. Here though, quite an unusual move, h4. We're kind of out of book now after this h4 move. The immediate technical point is, can the pawn be taken? Not really, because of knight takes c6, and that weakness of the last move, neglecting d6, is punished here, with white standing better, getting that centre pawn for a flank pawn, and black's pawn structure is fractured here. This will be very pleasant indeed for white. So h4, black actually plays knight de5, knowing that an immediate eviction, knight c4 is quite nice for the knight. If white tried to play this, I think knight c4 here is quite nice. And then queen b6, and there's pressure. This is really annoying pressure, and white's on the retreat. This is not what white really wants. It looks quite uncomfortable. So, in fact, here, the move g5 is played. And again, you might think, well, isn't knight c4 available here? Because this neglect with this bishop fianchetto, so doesn't it have this downside? Let's just check out the downside. Knight c4 here. I think white might not actually, it might not be technically best to play bishop c1 here. Maybe first taking on c6. If we take on c6 first, then bishop c1. I don't think queen b6 has much bite to it. For example, now b3, and we can safely evict that. And knight a4 even, and so this is starting to be okay for white. So the knight c4 doesn't seem okay, as though it's a brilliant move in this position after g5. So black actually plays bishop d7, and now white plays knight takes c6. What was actually black's intention? If not, well, maybe rook c8, and it is comfortable generally on the c file. So knight takes c6 interrupts black a little bit. But now after bishop takes c6, we have now white actually ruling out knight c4 in advance of potential f4 by playing the move b3, and you might think this is a little bit risky in its own right. Is the medicine worse than the cure to stop knight c4 counterplay? Well, to examine this, we're weakening the dark squares. Can we pounce on the dark squares this time? I don't think so. Queen a5. It might actually be, the engines actually suggest queen a5 is a good move here, though. That they do feed on that weakness of the last move, though queen a5 is quite good. But I wonder, queen d2, it looks as though black might be energizing with d5 a little bit, his position. If we take care, then bishop b4, and that is very, very painful. Ouch. This starts to look quite painful, this sort of thing. It looks as though, especially this dynamic line the engine is suggesting, it looks absolutely delicious for black. The dark squares, they are being severely punished indeed. So maybe, you know, queen a5, it does look an interesting try. We looked at queen d2 there. I wonder queen d4 if that's an improvement. Well, what does black do in this position? I think the point is queen d4 is a kind of upgrade on queen d2. There's no d5 without dropping e5, and there's no use of f6. This pawn handles that. So I think queen d4 here might actually be okay. So b3 has stopped the knight c4 stuff without fatally weakening the dark squares. Okay, so if we can prove that, then maybe that helps explain why Topalov was after something else. And he played something which I thought intuitively was risky during the live streams, f5. Okay, he's exploiting the pressure of the pin on the pawn. He gives his knight g4. It looks like attractive here, so the knight is not too fussy if it's c4 or g4. They look both like nice squares. The knight coming to g4 would attack the bishop on e3. Okay, but the reason I think it's kind of risky, well, I think it's actually in Vishy's continuation. It's kind of committal to have pawns like this, but we'll see. I just intuitively thought this kind of move f5 statistically, if you look at the games where black's been horrifically crushed, they often have been playing moves like f5 at some point, f4. There's some horrible games in the tournament with f5. It kind of weakens the diagonal, it weakens e6. But are these significant factors here? The bishop's being chatted. In this particular position at the moment, it doesn't seem too weakening. It's not like a future invitation to into black's position at the moment. And after, okay, Vishy's next move, f4, we see knight g4, and I believe this looks like a kind of logical positional sacrifice if you do consider bishops better than knights. Rather than retreat the bishop to g1, I think the official commentators were alluding that, you know, bishop g1 and black would be doing well. I think this just gives black time, this sort of move. Like say rook c8, they look kind of passive. There looks to be a lot of congestion. No, I think this is a good case for giving up the bishop. And Vishy said after the game, you know, this bishop's kind of hemmed in by this pawn structure here. It's geared against the dark square bishop. And if you look at these other squares for the bishop to come into the game later, they might not be immediately, it's not immediately possible to do that, because we are going to have to nanny the e6 pawn if black does take the bishop, which he did do. And the engine suggests this is a good move for black to have technically an advantage, believe it or not, more than just equal technically. According to the Nxd4 here, this is as though it's black's doing well here. But I'm not so sure, because, you know, the bishop pair here, this structure really is geared against the dark square bishop on e7. And white does seem to have lots of potential central pressure going on here, with a lovely option of e takes once this pin situation is resolved. Now here, perhaps this is a first more serious weakening, though. Possibly black could just consider castling, and if white castled, then yes, okay, can black one day look forward to the dark square bishop? I'm a bit cynical of its prospects here, because of this central pressure leaning on black. You know, even if we played like this, how does black actually tap into the dark squares? So anyway, Veselin played f takes e4, and white just castled queenside, so he's putting more pressure on black. He didn't just, if he routinely captured, then this might backfire a little bit. d5 actually, and what's happening here? We'd have to castle to use the pin on the queen, and bishop a3 check. The bishop is actually looking quite well here. This does look like a nice position for black, again on the dark squares. But yeah, I think this might be a slight inaccuracy, technically at least, it seems, from an engine perspective. F takes e4. White castles queenside here. And Veselin does activate his dark square bishop with d5. It gives him a French defense style structure, but it does mean there's a backward pawn potentially on the semi-open file if this pawn was removed. And this is a really strange thing. Knight takes e4. It's as if Veselin says he didn't estimate this move. Maybe he did see it, but didn't see continuations after. I find it hard to believe he wouldn't have considered knight takes e4 here. But it does fundamentally leave him with this backward pawn on the semi-open file, and this French defense structure here classically hems in the light square bishop. But this e5 in front of the backward pawn is also very useful. From a Nxd4 perspective, you can blockade, for example, double pawns in front of them are quite useful. But here, the backward pawn, if the knight ever reroutes like this is a very nice blockade as well. These structural weaknesses can be tortured, restrain, then blockade, then destroy, as Nxd4 would say. So anyway, for the moment, Veselin plays bishop a3 check after king b1. We see queen e7, and now, yes, Nxd4 strategy, knight f2. We're going to blockade the e6 pawn. It's the backward pawn. Also it gives us immediate options to attack it, so black has to be prepared for things like rook he1 as well. But the blockade knight d3 would also rule out bishop c5, if that's going to be useful for black. It should be played now, and black does play it now. Queen g3, and he doesn't want to permit this knight d3. It will just be a strangulated position, knight d3. I don't think the dark square bishop can actually do anything tactically to balance that. If we try and just look at this very briefly, let's entertain the idea of allowing knight d3. Bishop d4. So you might think, well, is there some problem? The knight's actually controlling b2 here. Rook he1. And we've got things like f5 now. That the backward pawn can be tortured with all sorts of things. Bishop h3, it's a subject of torture. Queen a3 is just simply not threatening anything. So that doesn't look too happy for black, that position. So Veselin gave up his dark square bishop, just leaving him with a classic French defense, bad bishop and backward pawn on e file. It looks as though that f pawn would have been handy to support the poor pawn on e6. So black castled here, but on the other hand, black does seem to have f4 to play with at least, which hasn't also, like this one, it hasn't got the support of pawns behind it. Queen d4 creates a lock on the dark squares against e5, still protecting f4. Seems an entirely logical centralizing move, and white stands better now. This is a position where black has to be wary of having the counterplay taken out of his position. Rook f5, so preparing as though to double rooks on the f4 pawn. Rook de1, and now rook a f8, and now rook hf1. And here is a situation, it's a classic situation really. White actually has a major threat here of bishop h3. So this bishop is actually slightly better than this one, much more aggressive, because it can attack this one and this one. It's going to be a disaster if e6 is lost like that. It forces black to do something in emergency against bishop h3 here. Black actually played queen d6. And this is a beautiful move, transitioning pawn structure here, which apparently is the best move in the position. You might think it's a bit weird. It's kind of an exchange of prisoners, as Nxd4 would say, that there are two prisoners at stake here, and they're kind of traded for each other not to be as seemingly exploitable. White actually plays rook e5. So the thing is, white now has lots of attractive options coming up if black doesn't take on e5. Maybe just increasing the squeeze or playing bishop h3. These are the attractive options which might arise, which would force rook e5 in any case. So rook takes e5 is played here anyway, and after f takes e, you might think, well, hasn't white lost something, this frontal pressure against e6? Well, on the other hand, black's lost his frontal pressure on the f4 pawn, so it's kind of exchange of weaknesses a little bit to transition them into white having that space advantage instead. But this pawn is still vulnerable theoretically to this diagonal, whilst white has the pawn on a dart square here, tucked away from black with this lovely blockade on the dart squares. That's not going to be as accessible as the e6 pawn in this position. And that's why white, I think, is slightly better here. So rook takes, bishop takes. Has white traded away a significant amount of his advantage? Not according to engines. So here, queen e7. I say that because engines are really going to be able to answer the question, are the weaknesses exploitable through technical analysis of variations? Is this weakness going to be more exploitable? Well, white, with pawns on dark squares here, is away from the bishop anyway. These pawns are on light squares. They're a target. And very, very interesting move now as well in this position, that black's pawns here, the mobility of them is also put in check with this next move. A fantastic positional move. a4. Vishy is increasing his stranglehold on the dark squares. If he can accomplish a5, the queen's going to be nannying this pawn shortly. It won't be able to chase the a5 pawn, and white will get a lock on two pawns for the price of one pawn, locking down two pawns. And this is classic positional strategy, locking down the opponent's pawn structure on both sides of the board usually. Players like Michael Adams from the UK, specialist in this, and he's nicknamed the Spider, slowly strangulating his victims, weaving this net, so they can't move, immobilizing them. I know that's a bit sick, but this is the kind of thing. a5 is a slow strangulation. Black is just sitting passively here with pawns which are essentially a fixed target to this bishop. So black actually plays bishop e8. At least this diagonal looks as though the bishop can fend off things with bishop f5, maybe on this diagonal. And we actually see Vishy allowing this. So king b2, I mean, what else? If he goes pawn hunting, or I mean, this actually threatens tactically bishop takes a6, but it doesn't seem as principled as sitting on the blockade. It looks quite technically exploitive, but does it actually backfire here? For example, I mean, there's technical variations like bishop takes a4 here. If takes, this is a draw, check. Apparently it's 0 to engine. So that's why, in principle, this seems to be the simple way to play it, to keep the lovely blockade on d4 rather than try and exploit emergent tactics. So king b2, that looks like a position improving the security here, avoiding this pawn being pinned, getting the king on the dart square away from the bishop. So just ruling out tactics well in advance, prophylaxis. So bishop g6. And now finally, this pawn can be scrutinized, start to be scrutinized with bishop h3. So bishop f5 not possible because white can just take on d5. So the strangulation continues. h6 though is prompted by black, and it's a blunder. It looks like a very loose move, h6. Instead, what can black do? This is what Veselin Topalov played, h6. He is in a slightly passive position, but can white actually increase his advantage here, just based on this e6 pawn? If we look at, say we look at bishop e4, could black have kept solid? Would it have been a draw, this position, theoretically? Should it be a draw, theoretically, this position? Well, it sometimes does need more than one weakness to be a strong player, you need more than one weakness. So even though e6 is a weakness, can we actually exploit that here? If we go with queen b6, then the king could help defend, and black does seem to be resourceful enough to hold the e6 pawn, unless white can use the blockade hits for this virtual extra pass pawn to do something. So he could increase his grip with a5 and try and maybe introduce a pass pawn later, but it seems a long way off. There would be it would seem a long involved process here to try and win this position. So we see this looks like a very surprising move, giving white what he needs, potentially an extra weakness to target, because after g takes, forcing move queen g4, quite painful. King f7, we see an extra weakness here. So in conjunction with this one, now we're cooking with gas, so to speak. We've got two weaknesses to play with, and this weakness is fixed. So both sides of the board, they're getting locked down here. h5, bishop e4, a5, locking down both sides of the board. Okay, so now white is actually clearly better. What does it need now after bishop h7? The queen is nannying the e6 pawn. There's also a horrible idea of queen f4 check, which doesn't quite maybe work yet in this position. White needs to induce a kind of zugzwang, and he does that with c3, a very, very powerful waiting move. It's just very, very unfortunate configuration now for black. He's losing a pawn by force. If you consider the queen can't move, the pawns can't move, you're left with the queen and the bishop. If the king moves over here, we're going to lose e6, so the king can't move, so it's a virtual zugzwang. And the problem is, so after bishop e4, black is losing a pawn by force virtually to c4. So if this takes, then we lose the bishop. I've checked this technically, that c3 is a perfect waiting move. It's actually much stronger technically than the immediate c4. On the immediate c4, bishop e4, this is not so easy, this position. Black's holding his weaknesses. And he queen f4 check, king g7. And this is not so easy. But in this position, this crushing, what I call a crushing waiting move really, it's like the zugzwang feel to it. Yeah, this is a nightmare. When does the bishop go? If it goes to d3, then thanks very much, it's a check, and then we win a pawn like that. The bishop, we just take that. So yeah, this c4 here, based on more mobile pawns than black, like a virtue, this is an extra pawn in effect to move. But here c4, black is in serious trouble. He's losing a pawn now by force. You might think, well, can't he do something like queen g5? Is that not possible? Queen g5? Well, we lose e6. Black is tied down to e6 all the time here. What does black do? He plays bishop f5, and now after queen f4, we've got h6 and we've got f5. Double attack. Double attack stem for more than one weakness being scrutinized. Now here you might think, well, what about queen g5 here? Black didn't play queen g5 here, because actually we can take here, bishop takes f5, and we've got two running passed pawns now which overload the black king. So h6, and what does black do? As soon as he goes here, then e6, and that will do. The king can't cope with both, so that's not possible. Queen g5. So black plays d takes c4, which allows bishop takes f5. Black, I guess, could consider c3 check. It's still losing a pawn basically. For getting just one check, it's harmless. I think white has accurate king moves here though. Instead of king b2, apparently more accurate is king d3, and then put the king here, believe it or not. And this is good. But in the game, okay, black loses the pawn like this. After e takes, queen takes. Now black is virtually forced to play king e8. If king g7, then queen g6 check, forwarded by that pawn on h5. Then we could take here, we've got a lovely passed pawn here. And this is we can exchange off the queens and just win that trivially, that king and pawn ending. So king, after queen takes f5, king e8, which allows technically check to get this pawn with check. So pawn up. So how does Vichy do this at pawn up? Well, with great care. So king f8, he brings his king in slowly. King can go into these dark squares one day, as long as the king's not going to get mated something embarrassing like queen f2. That has to be factored in. So bringing up the pawns, check, queen e7, check, king d5. Black is getting squeezed here, and e6 is now on the cards. King c7. So now e6 will be a mistake. Queen d6 will make things harder for white, although white's still better there. So anyway, queen g6. Now here again, this scenario of just taking here, we just get this winning king and pawn ending. Well, just queen d6 check. This is a winning king and pawn ending because this pawn is single-handedly restraining these two. So that's totally trivially winning. So it's good to have these restraints on both sides of the board, just for the endings, if nothing else, for extra passed pawns. So queen h4 was played. We have check, and then the king ventures in with king c5. For the moment, queen d4 for this sensitive diagonal is very, very useful. So queen f2, that's tested. Queen f7. Now queen c4, so the king really wants to come to b6 to help, or d6 potentially. Queen g7. King b6 check. King b8. Now a non-cautious move where you'd lose 500 points could include something like queen e6, where there's a mate in one with either this one, mate in one, or this one. So you want to avoid that. So nope. Vichy plays queen c5, filling the dark squares there, stopping any naughtiness on the dark squares, either at c7 or g1, this diagonal. Slowly making inroads here. Queen f7, now check. And now if king a8, then this is now harmless. In fact, there's no time for it because queen d8 is a pretty quick checkmate. With the king there, it's an attacking piece, stopping the king. So it's helped the checkmate. So king c8 was played, but now just e6. And you might think, well, actually Veselin resigned here. If he plays this check, then check in defense. And if queen takes, b takes. This is trivially winning this king and pawn ending. So I think, yeah, very, very interesting game. Nimzovician style restraints on both sides of the board. Black lost the game with that move h6. I think this is the absolute critical blunder which took Black beyond a defendable threshold when he had played this move in this position. It was okay potentially in this position for Black. Without h6 though, that creates another weakness. Easy for spectators and everyone with engines after to know this technically, but this is technically apparently this put Black's position into a lost position. This move h6, essentially creating another weakness. But fantastic for Vichy. In the old days of Botvinnik, Botvinnik with the old File system had the right for a rematch the next year, but Vichy at the moment is doing that the hard way without such a luxurious rule, with no right to a rematch with Magnus Carlsen, but he's earning that right at the moment. And at the moment now, after this round 9 and the rest day, he's a full point clear right now of the rest. So he's in a great position here to earn his rematch the very, very hard way. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.